Welcome to Calvinian architecture on a chilly day in Mildura. The story I'm reading you today from the 5th octave, 6th chapter, Eusapia, is the story of a journey, and I've decided to read it to you from the beautiful garden of Yes, created by Ross Lake and Helen Vivian in Irimple, just outside Mildura. And under that mound that you see behind me lie all, or many of my most precious possessions. My father's car, my car, my parents' furniture, my children's toys, many artworks, various objects. And as they lie under there, they feed and nurture the 7 trees that grow on top of the mound, each blossoming in a particular colour that corresponds to the spectrum. So I wanted to contextualize the story reading today. Verse 2. I'm climbing up the stone stairways that lead all the way from the port to San Giusto's, Trieste's cathedral. Its Romanesque mass dwarfs the stone ruins of the Roman Forum strewn around the open space directly to the side of it. The Joyce Steps are just below us, named after the Irish genius who lived here for 11 years teaching English at the Berlitz School. He started making notes for his Ulysses down in a cafe, only a few doors from where I was born, but that's another story, isn't it? I always walk up to this highest point by the same route, stopping at the same places, enjoying the same views. When I'm inside the church, I walk up close to the altar where my parents were married, and then to the stone font at the back of the church where I was baptized. I sit in a pew for a while, letting my mind drift, watching the changing light suffuse the colours of the stained glass rose. Later outside, stray cats wander in and out of the stones, looking for a warm place in the sun. Many swallows dart joyously about. I sit on a stone and look down to the harbour and the sea. The day of our departure was also a beautiful early summer's day. My grandfather had refused to come down to the docks and say goodbye to us, fearing he'd break down. And as the boat made its first ever so imperceptible at first, I thought I was imagining it and only realised we were moving when I began to notice the space between the boat side and the dock widen irrevocably. Imperceptible movement away from the pier. We saw him making his way through the throng of relations and well-wishers crowding around the bottom of the gangplank. He pushed his way through, waving his walking stick until he stood on the granite directly behind us. He was mouthing something, a message, but I could not hear him. Tears were streaming down his cheeks, unshaven now for days. That remains the last image I have of him, for I never saw him again. It's an image I can't forget. Swallows darted repeatedly between and around those of us on the boat and those of us standing below on the dock, as though this was a singularly happy event, as though the increasing void between us was illusory. It seemed to me as a child that the swallows were trying to sweeten the separation by delivering final messages to all those present above and below. Though the inevitability of a final severance as the boat gathered speed and its manoeuvres was now impossible to deny. The swallows did try, it seemed to me. They did try to maintain the efficacy of that most invisible of networks, that tracery of glances and cries and panicked last-minute searches for the face of a loved one that wringing of hands and hearts as nails were dug deep into 100 palms. They did try, through their furious, determined flying, to keep it all alive, keep it functioning, and eventually, when the distance between the twin terminals of that most remarkable energy structure got too great and the entire crazy mass of wildly, spiralingly, intricately woven, multicoloured eddies collapsed into the green and blue waves of that gulf, they flew away and immediately focused their attention on some other redemptive deed that I'm sure deserved to be undertaken that afternoon around the hills of Trieste. High clouds, swallows and bright spring skies always make for a joyful sight in Trieste. I remember yet another spring day like this one, but already belonging to another millennium. As soup is laid steaming on the table, windows are open for the first time since early autumn. A few daisies sit in a bottle placed in the middle of the table. My uncle Attilio leans out of the window in his undershirt, looking at a streaky sky. Suddenly a swallow flies right by him. He turns his face around, beaming. "Primavera," he says. He'd picked those daisies among weeds growing sparsely between the boarded up trailers of the amusement park, not yet opened for summer business. One evening that previous summer, I'd chosen to ride with him rather than with my father in a Dodgem car ride. My father then, dark-faced, abruptly retreated to an undone chore at home. As we rode together under the coloured lights, Attilio's own softly dark face softened further. "You should have said yes to him," he said. Now he feels bad. Later he carried me asleep all the way from the park, and I later awoke upstairs in my father's arms. 10 years later, Attilio resolutely walked into a dark tunnel, into oncoming traffic. They said he flew 50, 60 metres through the air. My father told me of his death one spring afternoon in Melbourne after we'd travelled by train deep into the outer suburbs in order to see the house he'd been preparing for us. It was in the country, he said. It's in Campania. Anything much beyond Smith Street, Fitzroy, was then in the Campania. He proceeded to proudly show us the asbestos fireplace cover in the living room that he'd painted over with many patches of bright, glorious colour, blues, reds, yellows, greens, all outlined in thick black enamel. Arte moderna, he called it proudly. Then he took me outside and told me the bad news. I looked up into the sky. I could not say anything. I stood very still. It was then that I suddenly noticed some swallows had been nesting under the eave right by what was to be our new kitchen door. I've seen many swallows in Mildura, and there are some early returns from God knows where, right now in this garden, coming back to their nests once more. Until tomorrow.